Good evening, ladies and gents. I've had a few questions this week, essentially asking me, what do I change in cinema? What settings, what preferences, what things do I adjust? So I thought for this video we'd go through cinema and I'll show you the sort of things which I adjust. Primarily we're talking things for speed, things to make your life easier, just maybe changing one or two defaults which aren't perhaps the best. So let's dive in and I'll show you what I do. Let's see. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is take a look at some of our preferences. So if you go up to Edit and then down to Preferences, the first thing I would generally change in here would be the highlighting. Now you may have noticed in the past version or two, quite a few settings seem to have this yellow text. And whilst this does have a use, it's basically there to show you which features are new. You probably don't want it there all the time, certainly not past the first week or so. So in your preferences on the very first page, if you go down to Highlight Features, this will show you all of the new features which were added in this particular case, version 19. Just turn this off. And now all this highlighting vanishes and you can get a better idea about which icons you actually have turned on. The next thing I'd suggest would be maybe this Attribute Manager Selection Limit. Now this has been improved recently in the past year or two, but well, it could be better. Now, what is it? What does it do? Well, if I take a MoGraph cloner and a cube, and I pop that cube inside the cloner, I'm just going to clone up, let's see, 5,000 cubes. Let's not move them. At least not much. Okay, so there's 5,000 cubes. I'll make them editable so that they're actually real objects. And I'll just take them out of this null object because I don't want it there. So let's just ungroup. Let's expand this object group. Okay, so what this does is this is set to 5,000 here. Older versions of Cinema, this was set to 1,000. So be careful with this number. But basically, here's the last cube in my list, and I'm just going to pop it over here, and I'm going to add one more cube. So this is the first cube in my object list, and this is the last cube in my list. So I've got right now 5,001 objects. Here's the issue. This limit stops Cinema from using too many objects. So if I go to select all, just Control A or Command A if you're on a Mac, I now have 5,001 objects selected. You can see in my list, all of these are highlighted. Yet my attributes only says I have 5,000 things. So what happens is, if I try to adjust this object, let's say I make it thinner. Oops, no, thinner, not shorter. 5,000 of them change, but the last one in the list, this guy down here, simply doesn't get adjusted. So if you're trying to change lots of lights or lots of objects in your scene and you're finding some things just don't work, it's this. So turn this up and, well, let Cinema adjust all your objects as you probably wanted. Okay, anyway, next thing on our list is maybe, so some of these things are optional. I don't change all of these, but they're good to know about. The next one is going to be Synchronize Views. So let's see, where's it hiding? Navigation, yep, okay. If we go down to navigation, we have Synchronize Orthographic Viewports. What this does is quite useful. It does have a downside though, I'll let you know about that in a moment. Here's my happy little stick man. And if I come out to my 4 views, there we go. Each of these views is independent. I can move and zoom and rotate each of these by themselves. What you can do though is synchronize them, and now when you move, all of them will move, all of them will zoom. So it makes all of these views happen simultaneously. Now whilst this is quite nice, just watch out, it does slow the software down quite a bit. If you're suddenly updating 3 views instead of just the single one that you'd normally be using, well, it does slow it down on heavy scenes. So maybe turn this off if your project's quite heavy, but it can be quite nice to have because it just allows all these views to sort of follow each other around so you're not endlessly trying to find bits of your object. Okay, next up, anti-aliasing. So come down to OpenGL. This is your real-time view, basically. And if you just want to speed it up, what you can do is get rid of the anti-aliasing. Now, if you've got a good card, let's say, at this point in time at least, a GeForce 980 or a 1080, don't worry about this, you're not going to notice much difference. But if you've got something a bit more modest, this can slow scenes down a bit when they get more complicated. If you just turn the anti-aliasing off for your view, set it down to none, you'll now get slightly jagged lines. I'm not sure how well this will actually come through in the video because it's quite a subtle change, but yeah, all it's doing is getting rid of those jagged lines, and well, you can deal with a few jagged lines in your viewport. You don't need this stuff permanently, turned on. Let's see what's next. Okay, maximum lights. Now, let's say you're working on an architectural scene, and in your scene you have some light, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 light sources. You will see all of these 8 lights working in real time in your viewport quite nicely. But what happens if I make a 9th light source? This new light does affect the scene. But if you're looking carefully, you may have noticed, hold on, this one stopped working. This light over here no longer does anything. And that's because real-time OpenGL generally only displays 8 light sources at once. If you need more, turn this up. The maximum limit is 20, so you can get a bit more lighting in your scene. Keep in mind this will slow things down a bit, that's why it's set down at 8 by default. Yeah, it's there if you want it, so if you need more lights, turn it up, but keep in mind the limit is 20. I can't go any higher than this. As soon as I enter a higher number, it just goes down again. Let's see what else we got. Okay, units. One thing I definitely change is the units. Cinema by default works in centimeters, which it's okay. It's better than it used to be when it was working in meters, but it's still quite a chunky measurement. If I'm doing product visuals, it's too big. Even if I'm doing architectural scenes, centimeters is quite a big size to be using. Flick this down to millimeters, and you can now work in mil in your editor. And all the Americans working in imperial units. Good luck with that. Let's see. Color settings. Okay. Right. So if we go down to this section here, this is your color chooser. So in other words, when you make a material and you open it up, we're talking about this section here. You can choose different color pickers. Now, I do quite like the HSV system. It's quite nice to work with, but some people may prefer RGB. If that's the case, you can nip over here and turn off HSV and turn on RGB. This means from now on, whenever you make a new material in a new scene, Cinema will show you RGB sliders. Now, it's probably not going to do it in this project. I need to make a new file for this to actually wake up and do it. He hopes, fingers crossed. Nope, still not doing it. Might need a restart of the software. But anyway, this is what you will see by default whenever you create a material. So in other words, we're talking about this, getting some RGB sliders. The other bit which can be useful is if you are going to go for RGB, I'm not personally a fan of the way these change. So this shows you what the color is going to be when you click. So if I click here, I will get cyan. If I click here, I will get green. Which, sure, it's logical, but I would rather just have these sliders be red, green, and blue. If that's the case, open up this setting and show the old RGB sliders. Now you've just got plain old red, green, blue. You might find this is a bit more intuitive. I prefer this one myself. Okay, that should largely do it, although sometimes I will change the swatch size as well. So if you do use Cinema's sort of palettes of ready-made colours, by default they look like this, which is kind of small. You know, these things are actually smaller than my mouse pointer. If you right click, you can choose a larger size, and if you want, you can set the default down over here. Okay, what else have we got? Okay, more undo. So let's go down to memory. how much memory the software uses. Undo depth. Basically, this is how many times you can press undo. And if you've got a decent machine, let's say at least 16 gigs, you know what? Crank this up. Go for 100, go for 200. There's been countless times when I've worked on a project and I know I've made a mistake and I've got to press undo quite a few times. But it's been sort of 40 actions ago or 50 actions ago. If you bump this up to 100, you're going to have a much higher chance of actually having the thing you wanted to go back to be in memory for you to change. And whilst you're in this section, also consider this bit here, picture viewer memory. When you render an image to your picture viewer, in other words, the sort of normal render view, this takes up memory. And if you're doing an animation and you want to be able to play it back really nicely and smoothly, you need to load all of the frames of animation into memory. The problem is, maybe sort of 100 or 200 frames of animation and you've filled the 1 gigabyte of space which is reserved. So again, if you've got a machine with loads of memory and you're just never ever running out, so maybe sort of 32 gigs, 64 gigs, whack a 0 on the end. Give the picture viewer 10 gigs of memory and you can store hundreds and hundreds of images rather than having to offload them off to the hard drive. So again, if you've got the memory, do this. Just keep in mind, Cinema will start using up more and more RAM if you bump up this limit. Let's see. Okay, render threads. That's the other thing on my list. So this is going to affect you differently depending on your operating system. I will say this affects Windows worse than the Mac. The Mac copes quite well when you've got quite heavy, slow rendering going. Windows, unfortunately, the system keels over and dies. So your processor, it will have probably 4, 6, 8, maybe 16 CPU cores. What this means in reality, though, is all modern processors have what we call hyperthreading. So personally, I have an 8-core system, but the hyperthreading basically doubles this. So Cinema can handle 16 things at once on an 8-core machine. The problem is if you allow Cinema to use all 16 threads, as we call them, the system locks up. When you hit render, you can't browse the internet, you can't check your email, you can't watch a video on your second screen. The whole system just grinds to a halt and becomes unusable. So what I personally do, and what I'd recommend for most Windows users, turn on, in your render settings, turn on custom number of threads. And basically take the number of processors, the number of CPU cores your machine has, double it, and then take off 2. So I have an 8-core machine. Double it up, that's 16, and then just take a couple off. So that brings me down to 14. This will lose you about maybe 5% of your render speed. It's only a pretty small price to pay, but your machine will remain usable. So I can now go do some photoshopping, I can edit some video, I can go watch do whatever else. My machine won't be tied up. So yeah, so just as another example, if you've got a 4-core machine, which is kind of most popular at the minute, 4, double it up, that will be 8. Take off 2, knock it down to 6. You will still be using all of your processor cores. You just won't have so much stuff queued up, clogging up the system. Yeah, anyway, there you go. Mac users, maybe give it a go. I have worked on a few Mac systems where this does slow down and make the system unusable, but it is mostly a Windows thing. And whilst we're in the render settings, let's just unfold this, go down to Team Render, and turn it on. If you have a spare machine, or 2, or 3, or 4, use Team Render. You can speed up your renders by distributing your rendering workload. Just turn on Team Render. Where it says security token, this is basically a password. Now, this is irrelevant. Nobody is breaking into your system to steal your render power from Cinema. So just set it to something incredibly easy to remember. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nice, safe password there. And that's it. You can now use Team Render in this copy of Cinema. And the password will be easy to remember. Not that it really matters. Okay, that will do for the preferences. There is some more stuff I will show you. So let's close that down. Next thing I would generally suggest you do on most installations is turn off object highlighting. Here's a cube. Here's another cube. When you move your mouse above the object, you can see these objects highlight. And this is useful. It's just unfortunately incredibly slow. You can see how sluggish and slow this is when I move the mouse around. When you get a complicated scene, when you're doing an architectural interior, this really, really slows cinema down. I would just suggest you turn the feature off. I mean, let's just be honest. If I go to my filter menu here and scroll all the way down to objects, where you gone? Object highlighting. Okay, the highlighting's gone, but you know what? I can still click on objects. It's not the worst loss in the world, and the speed up you get is quite significant. So I would always turn this one off. Where's who next? What's on my list? Okay, Object Manager. Now, this Object Manager list depends on your screen, your resolution, your visual settings, frankly, your age and your eyesight, but you can tweak these Object Manager settings. So, for example, right now I have large icons selected. So whenever I add an object, maybe a bit of this, bit of that, some lights, it's quite chunky, it's easily clicked, the icons are quite obvious as to what they do. By default, if I go to View, Icon Size, the default is medium, which is okay. I'm sure you get more in there, but it's a bit small. If you've got really good eyesight and you just want to get loads of stuff into your list here, go for small icons. You'll get even more objects, but yeah, good luck clicking all these little fiddly icons and not accidentally clicking things you didn't mean to. Personally, I go for a large icon. I've got a big screen. I can still see everything I need to see. Anyway, that's just me. Oh, by the way, just before I go any further, I should point out, these preferences, they will be saved as soon as you close the software. Okay, so when you've set those up, just close Cinema and relaunch it, and you will have saved everything. These next things I'm showing you, including the icon size, to save these, they're not saved in the preferences. What you've got to do is create a template. Now that will be under Script, User Script, Save as Template. If you are using an older version of Cinema, you might find this Save as Template option is hiding under Plugins instead. But anyway, this will save whatever settings your project has right now as the default. So be careful with this. If I save this as my template, next time I load Cinema and make a new project, I'm going to get a green material, a bunch of cubes, a deformer, a light. However this looks is how the software will look when you next load it. So when you're doing these adjustments, I would strongly suggest make a new blank file and don't mess around with anything. Otherwise, everything you're going to do will be saved, and you probably don't really want that. So let me just set the icon size. Okay, large, set that as you want. Next thing is takes. Now, I don't know whether you're using the take system at the minute, whether you are or whether you're not. One setting you will definitely want to change, so we're talking about this take system over here, is auto takes. If you're using the take system, you pretty much want this turned on. It's just blindingly obvious as a useful default setting. So turn it on. There you go. Activate it, and now if you use the take system, Cinema will actually remember what you do, which is, hey, useful. Let's see, what else have I got here? Animation length. If I'm doing an animation, it's almost certainly not 3 seconds long. I tend to go for maybe sort of 200, 300, 400 frames as a default project length. If you're doing a little title sting, sure, 3 seconds maybe, but even if you're just playing around, go for, I don't know, whatever works for you. Go for 300 frames, zoom out so you can see all those frames in your timeline. Yeah, that's just a much more useful length of animation to play with. And whilst we're down here, so this one will vary a bit, frame rate. Cinema defaults to 30 frames per second, which is generally a very good choice. So I'm not knocking that in any way. But if you're in a certain region in the world and you're working for TV and broadcast, you might want to use 25 for TV broadcast in Europe. You might want to use 24 if you're going to be working for film. Or you might want to go for 60 if you're going to be doing some nice fluid video for websites and YouTube and so on. So maybe whilst we're doing all of this stuff, set a better default frame rate if that is useful to you. Now, there is a couple of really, really useful bits down here, which I have to say are some of the most overlooked and missed settings ever. So let me take a typical example. Let's say you do product visuals for a job. You're doing bottles, packaging, that sort of thing. What happens when you create a cube? Okay, there's a cube. How big is it? 2 meters wide, 2,000 mil. This is the size of a garden shed. If you're trying to put bottle caps onto your bottles or little cardboard flaps onto your packaging, this is incredibly irritating. But there is a fairly straightforward way around a lot of this stuff. When you start a project, you will see your project settings down here. If you're missing this window, just go to Edit, Project Settings. This, Project Scale. Don't change the bit to the side. All you need to do here is choose a better scale. And to be honest, this setting is so useful, I might actually go off and do a video just on this one thing, but seeing as we're setting up the software, I'll mention it here as well. I don't want everything to be 2 meters wide by default. That's ridiculous. I want everything to be maybe 1/10 of that, or even 100th of that. Just whack some decimal points in here, and it fixes a lot of it. So right now we have a scale of 1. If I go for 0.01, this will make everything 100 times smaller. So when I make a cube now, hey, look, it's 20 mil wide. It's yay big. Much more useful if you're doing small objects. And it does also affect a lot of other things. If I'm working with my modeling tools, let's say I've got a cube, it's editable, I'm working in polygon mode, and I want to extrude this face. When I go to extrude this face, watch my offset. Every time I click and drag my mouse, it moves 1 millimeter at a time, which is not awful, but if you're trying to do maybe a little bevel on the edge of some cardboard or a little detailed bit on a bottle cap, 1 millimeter is quite a large chunk to move. If you, however, though, set your project scale to 0.01, now when I go to extrude, it doesn't move in steps of 1 millimeter at a time. It moves in sort of 6/100ths of a millimeter, which means I get much more fluid motion. It's far more controllable, and this will go for everything, all your tools, movement, scale, rotation, light settings. So long as you set this project scale to a much smaller size, you will find the software is much, much easier to work with. So incredibly important, that one. And it also affects your view as well. So this is one you're certainly going to have come across. Let's say I'm working on a small object and it's 10, oops, let's change it over here. And it's 10 by 10 by 10 mil. So this thing is a 1 centimeter cube. The problem you're going to have here is when you get close, boom, your view clips through the object. So long as you set, however, your project scale to 0.01, now when I take my 1 centimeter cube and I get close, yay, we're fine. No more clipping through there. There is another way of solving that. You do have this view clipping size, which you can set to small for small objects or big for big objects. But so long as you set this, it actually also shifts how all of this stuff down here works as well. Right. Just one little note on this though, by the way. If you do like to use this PBR light, watch out. When I move the light over here, you have all the illumination of 1,000 suns right now. This thing is absurdly bright. So what you're going to need to do, if you do want to use these sort of PBR lights, is just nip over to the photometric settings and either massively turn down the intensity or just turn off this photometric intensity. That fixes it immediately. It's now far more controllable. It illuminates your scene in a much more consistent way. Yeah, so just watch out for that a little bit. Right, what else have I got on my list here? Where did we get to? Yes, rotation quantizing. Okay, I have a cube. I'm looking at it from the side. Let's make it a bit more visible. Okay, I want to rotate this cube to, let's say, 45 degrees. A fairly common thing you might want to do, yeah? Well, we click and drag to start rotating, but we're going to hold shift. This will cause it to sort of snap. But the problem is, you can't snap it to 45 degrees. Watch this number down here. Or if I click here, will it do it? Yeah, there we go, right. So let's just straighten that back up again. So when I rotate this, round it goes, hold shift so it sort of snaps and quantizes. It does it in units of 10. You can't do a 45-degree angle. It's impossible. Madness. Let's fix it, shall we? Okay, this is the most well-hidden setting in the universe, so bear with me. Come down to your attributes, click the mode menu, which you've almost certainly never pressed before. Come down to, where have we gone? Modeling settings. Again, you've almost certainly never done this one. And jump on over, boop, to quantize. These are the settings Cinema will use whenever you hold shift. So let's set the rotation to snap to 5 degrees. This means we can now get 45-degree angles. Hooray. And whilst you're here, if you are using a smaller size, a smaller scale, you absolutely want to change these. When you hold shift, things move in units of 100 millimeters. Way too big. Probably set that down to 1 mil, if not 0.1 mil. And scaling, well, I'll be honest, I've never really felt the need to quantize my scaling. You know, I'm setting things to the size I want, not just units of 10%. But change it if you feel like it. Okay, right. Okay, so that's all of these settings in the general interface. There is one last thing, though, that you may want to change before you run the save as template command, and that is going to be in your render settings. There's a lot in here which you may wish to set up by default for your own tastes and preferences, so I'll leave those up to you. But there is one thing which you should probably change for faster renders in almost everything you do, and that is going to be under Options and Reflection Depth. Reflection depth is how many times an object can reflect back and forth. So imagine you had two mirrors, each sort of facing each other, and you can sort of see a reflection in this side and you can see a reflection in this side, but you'd be able to sort of see like this tunnel bouncing back and forth, back and forth. That's a fairly rare thing to actually ever have in 3D. So you can save yourself a lot of render time by telling your reflections to just stop before they go too far. Now, I do set most of my reflection depths down to just 1 or 2, and you can save yourself a boatload of render time doing this with very little visual difference. But just to be on the safe side, just to make sure it doesn't ruin your renders, maybe knock it down to 3. 3 is still a pretty safe option as far as this setting goes, and that will knock quite a chunk off your render times in a lot of cases. Okay, so once you've done those and once you've set everything else up that you're after, go to Script or Plugins and run the Save as Template command, and this will have saved everything. Just make sure you've gone back to your 3D view, you've deleted all the objects, you've got the tools selected that you want to be the defaults, and then run it, because everything you see will be saved as your sort of default state. Okay, right, there is one last area which I will generally deal with when I set up a new copy of Cinema, and that is the overall interface. So the first thing I tend to do is remove icons I don't want. If you hover your mouse above any of these toolbars, right click and choose Customize Palettes. This will give you not only the sort of list of all of your commands, It will also allow you to edit the tool palette. So there's certain things I tend to remove because in my humble opinion, they're not that useful, certainly for me, and I dare say for most people. I get rid of this grid icon over here, which allows you to move this world grid. Not a particularly common thing. It does have its uses, it does have its places, but I'm more likely to accidentally click it than ever actually want to use it. So just double click and it gets rid of that. And these two down here, same tool, get rid of these. Okay, and I will also tend to get rid of this tweak mode. This is not something I ever want to turn on and off. I'm not even sure really why it's an option, and I'm certainly not sure why it's a button in the tool palette. So let's get rid of this mouse icon. No one's really gonna miss that. That's the grid icons. That's tweak mode. Okay, animation buttons. I never ever want to go to the end of my animation. Okay, if I'm going to rewind or go to the end of the animation, it's the start. I want to see my animation. So you can probably quite safely lose the fast forward to end icon and get rid of a little spacer there. Whilst we're down here, there's another couple of icons which are really sort of making a bit of a stink. They're past their best. The first one is this P. These icons, by the way, these are animation filters. It allows you to choose what will be recorded. And one thing you very likely don't want to record are parameters. Now, we are not talking about the settings of objects. This P is an incredibly outdated bit of the software. It's absolutely redundant. We're talking about going back to a time when, in cinema, to edit the settings of an object, you used to have to double click the icon and it would pop up a new window with the settings. We're talking 20 years ago. This icon is redundant. It is pointless. Get rid of it. And depending on the version of cinema, you can probably say the same thing about this. PLA, point level animation. This is what we used to use to morph objects from one shape to another, but so long as you've got the character tools and you've got the morph tag and the pose tag, that is a far easier, far superior choice. So you very likely want to also get rid of this PLA icon down in the corner. And personally, I don't do much character animation, so this keyframe selection icon, I never use this. I'm either keyframing, automatic keyframing, or I'm clicking these animation dots. I never do keyframe selections. It's more of a character animation thing. So personally, I get rid of it. But if you want to do character stuff, you can get rid of that yourself. Okay, so let's see. Just looking down my list here. Okay, so the final thing really is go and add the things you want. I do a lot of MoGraph things. I think MoGraph is a pretty good set of tools. So just for a moment, turn off the Edit Palette button so that we can get back to sort of normal operation. And if you want to add any toolbar, just go to the toolbar. Let's say I really like these effectors. Rip this palette off. Go to that thin strip at the top and turn this into a floating window. What you can now do is either choose things from this list and add them to your tool palette. If you want to do that, just turn the edit palettes back on and just start adding things. Maybe we'll go for a Python effector and a step effector. So just start throwing things in you want. Or if you'd like to make one of these nice pull down menus, turn the edit palette back off again. What you can do is right click on this tool palette and down at the bottom is fold palette. This will convert all these icons into a pop-up icon. This, as long as we go back to edit our palettes, this can be turned on, dragged into the toolbar, and there you go. You can now turn this off, get rid of all this stuff, and this is a nice pull down menu with all of my effectors in. So feel free to do this with whichever menus you like. Maybe you want to throw in some particles, maybe you want to throw in some cloth or dynamics, or maybe some of the hair objects. Throw in whatever you like, because you've got a fair bit of empty space in here. Yeah, anyway. So once you're done, once you've added everything you want into your projects and you've got all the icons you want, you've lost everything you don't want, you do have to save this. Nip over to your window menu, come down to customization and choose save as startup layout. And from now on, this will be your default. So just keep in mind, these settings, they all get saved in slightly different places. Preferences are just saved with the software when you close it. Things within the editor are saved as that template file, script save as template, and the interface where the icons and toolbars and windows are, that is saved as the layout. So do bear that in mind. There are 3 places where these things get saved. If you're not sure where the thing gets saved, just save all 3 and you've probably got a pretty good chance that you're going to get the thing you need. Right, there we go. I think I've rambled on enough. That's a good half hour down there. So yeah, hope that's been useful. This has been Mash from 3D Fluff. I'll see you for the next video. Cheers for now.